Okay, dear viewers, thank you for joining us. You're watching our weekly program, Talk to OBN on OBN Horn of Africa. In this edition, we'll be discussing about the 14th regular session of House of People Representatives held on February 6, 2024. And Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed addressed peace, national security, fruitful efforts in Tigray, the GERD issue, diplomacy, foreign relation, and economic achievements gained this year. I joined by Mr. Zamadena Nagatu, Global Chairperson for Fairfax Africa Fund and a well-known economist in Ethiopia and beyond, as well as Dr. Konstantinos Brutesfa for his expertise. Dr. Konstantinos is an economist and senior economic advisor to the UN. Both of you, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, try to mention major discussion points raised yesterday, but we only focus on the economic achievements and the economic dynamics that raised yesterday. During the session, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed told the House that Ethiopia expects 7.9% economic growth this Ethiopian fiscal year. Mr. Zamadena, how do you see this growth and the government's anticipation of achieving 7.9% of economic growth in this year?
Right. First of all, thank you again for having me back on your program. As you indicated in your introduction, Prime Minister Abiy yesterday gave a detailed explanation about the Ethiopian economy. And as you said, the government is forecasting about 7.9% GDP growth for this current fiscal year. And then if we look at, it's somewhere between the 6.2 that the IMF is forecasting and 7.2. So that's a pretty strong performance for an economy that, as we've discussed in your program in the past, that had faced a number of challenges over the last 4 years, starting with COVID, and then, of course, the internal conflict, and then the Russia and Ukraine conflict as well had very significant impact, certainly not only on Ethiopia, but globally. So when you take all these factors into consideration for Ethiopia to grow anywhere between, as I said, 6.2 to 7.9%, it shows that the economy has been resilient despite challenges. Now, of course, the Prime Minister indicated what the growth drivers were. And I think, for example, the agriculture sector has done very well in the past couple of years and is expected to do very well this year. And as you know, the Ethiopian economy is a very significant portion of the Ethiopian economy still is dependent on agriculture. So when you have very significant, very high performance of the agriculture economy, you can see growth in the overall GDP. But I think if you look at the services industry has grown, obviously manufacturing has been challenged, but even there's been some growth. And I know there's very significant strategy by the Ethiopian government to transform the agriculture, the manufacturing sector. So when you take all these factors into consideration, I think 7.9 at the top end, but anywhere between 6.2 and 7.9 is a very good indicator of the resilience of the economy. But to be frank with you, in subsequent years, once things have stabilized, a lot of the reforms take place and they become effective, Ethiopia actually has the real possibility of growing more than 8 to 10%. And that's been indicated in past years, but also, despite, as I said, challenges, if we can grow that means it's not unreasonable to expect it to grow between 8 and 10 and 11% in the coming years. So in summary, that's what one of the key takeaways for many of us yesterday who watched the Prime Minister give the presentation, that the economy will continue to grow and might even grow even faster in the coming years.
Well, as stated, GDP is the collective performance of the economy, and Ethiopia has been performing very well for a long time. And as Mr. Zamadena said, the COVID challenge, the war in Ukraine, and now the war in the Middle East are complicating the world economy. And therefore, despite this challenge, the Ethiopian economy has been doing quite well, relatively to other economies in Africa and globally. And definitely with the improvements that I see now in different sectors of the economy, we'll see what will happen, but 8% growth will not be too much for this country, because this country has been on a double-digit growth for a long period of time. So given the fact that the Middle East crisis is not going to challenge us, I think definitely 7.9 might be achievable.
The PM also, while he addressed the parliament, members of the parliament yesterday, he said he really acknowledged and appreciated the new trend of the tax collection in Ethiopia. And he mentioned countries like Morocco and other neighboring nations in collecting taxes properly. And one way or another, the collected tax would contribute to the GDP of the, country. To what extent would tax play a pivotal role in boosting GDP of certain nation, Mr. Zamadena?
Sure. So to put things in perspective, today, Ethiopia, even by African standards, has one of the lowest tax collection as a percentage of GDP. I think it's approximately 10%. Our neighbor in Kenya, they're around 16, 17%. So not even comparing it to the European countries. So certainly a focus needs to be given to collecting the fair share of taxes, especially as we now migrate or as we pivot towards the private sector-led economic transformation. I think tax collection needs to be enhanced. I know there's a lot of discussion, a lot of strategies have been set up the last several years, but still, it is at the low end. I mean, there are very few countries in Africa, actually, who collect taxes as a percentage of GDP lower than Ethiopia, very few countries. So I think certainly that's, Prime Minister said yesterday, there's going to be a focus on enhancing that. Imagine, I think he used the example of France, where approximately 40% of GDP, taxes were about 40% of GDP. Considering the Ethiopian GDPs of $156 billion, or around 8 trillion, 40% of that would be 3 to 3.5 trillion billion. I mean, we're only at a fraction of that. So enhancing that, I'm sure the government has given a priority, but it's a must, especially, as I said, we've moved from a state-led corporations who used to pay taxes now to a private sector. Private sector is going to be leading the Ethiopian economy, the transformation. I mean, for example, if you noticed yesterday, the Prime Minister indicated that something like, I believe 75% or 80% of loans are now being given to the private sector. So that needs to be linked to the growth of the private sector's economic activity, but also to tax collection. So certainly it's appropriate to focus on the government getting its fair share, its appropriate share of taxes.
Well, tax collection has been a challenge all over the world for developing economies. And one is the institutional setup that we have for tax collection. And the second thing is the appreciation of the population on what constitutes taxes as a revenue for government. And therefore, it will be very important to do a massive kind of awareness campaign in our country in terms of tax collection. And the second thing is the institutional setup for tax collection must be well organized. The challenge is we have a country that's emerging out of serious economic challenge throughout the last century, and therefore the government has to find out ways and means of encouraging taxpayers to be able to pay their taxes more willingly. It's a very, 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 very difficult situation for all over Africa, where countries have found it very difficult to collect taxes. But definitely within the Ethiopian context and the digitization of the tax collection process, it will be important for the Ethiopian government to have one, permanent and reliable internet connections. Number two, to be able to connect to the consumers and customers more prolifically, to tell them that it's not just their duty, but their responsibility to be able to pay taxes. And therefore, what I see is, one, building institutions, and two, is to have appropriate human resources to be able to undertake this kind of work more extensively. What I see now is the tax collection is concentrated in major urban centers, and therefore this has to go to the wider Ethiopian society, where we have 120 million people, and much of the tax that are collected traditionally have been from Addis Ababa, and therefore this has to extend its arms to other parts of Ethiopia. We did a study at the Addis Ababa University some 12 years ago, and the per capita tax collection in most of the regions was less than 4 birr per person. And therefore, this is a challenge that the state has to work more on capacity building.
Again, speaking about export and import trades, PM Abiy Ahmed has said that the country earned 10.7 billion USD from goods and service, with earning of 4.5 billion in the first half of this year. How do you compare and contrast this figure with the previous years? To what extent would this shows the healthy economy of the nation this time?
Let me give you a practical example. We are in the manufacturing business in Ethiopia. We export 100% of our output. At the moment, we're exporting to Europe, and we're in the clothing manufacturing business. Okay. Now, if we can replicate these types of investments, both FDI, because we're a multinational company, but also at the domestic level, building up the capacity of Ethiopians to produce for the export market. Of course, that requires a structural transformation of the economy, right? But I think it's doable. So if we continue to migrate to an export-led and industrialized economy, then this gap that we have today between imports and exports, I think, can be overcome. As you've indicated, and the Prime Minister yesterday indicated in his presentation to the Parliament, there's a very huge gap at the moment. So we need to certainly produce more locally and incentivize, especially our private sector. There are a lot of industries that Ethiopia actually can have huge competitive and comparative advantages by producing stuff locally. So that needs to be part of the structural transformation of the economy. Needs to give focus to those industries. One, encouraging Ethiopians, giving incentive Ethiopians to produce for the export market, but also, of course, for the domestic market, because we have a huge domestic market. But since we're discussing export, so give incentives, encourage the Ethiopian domestic private sector to focus and invest. When I say incentives, for example, providing loans, subsidized loans, providing other types, providing, for example, the plots, the land, or the industrial park at very competitive rates, so that the Ethiopian private sector becomes. And this is a model that we've seen the Asian tigers, whether it's China, Korea, Singapore. They use this. They help create their domestic private sector so they can generate export. And I think that's very much needed, so that not only can we narrow the gap, actually we could be net exporters and reduce the pressure that we have today on FX, on foreign exchanges. It is doable. I use ours as an example, but there are many others who are starting to do that. But it can't just be FDI, right? We need our own domestic private sector. That way the revenue, the hard currency remains at home. The capex that we make will help reduce that in the long run. So exports as part of transformation needs to be given a priority focus. And I think also the Prime Minister discussed about inflation, how if we can produce domestically, we can reduce the pressure of inflation, but maybe on the next topic, we can discuss that. But export definitely needs to be given priority. And Ethiopia has huge competitive advantages in many sectors.
Well.
In many sectors.
How do you describe, the current trend of Ethiopia in the areas of import and export?
Hopefully, with the introduction of foreign banks here, there will be an infusion of capital into the Ethiopian industry, in the Ethiopian agricultural sector, where the economy is going to grow probably more in a revolutionary way. The main challenge in Ethiopia today is the finance. As I've said before, Ethiopian banks collectively don't have a long capital that will even build a major road or a major industry. And therefore, it will be very important that these two areas, which the government has started now, be completed as planned as soon as possible. Otherwise, being dependent on loans and foreign grants, it's not going to help the economy so much. So far, we've done very well. The loans have been producing tremendous amount of infrastructure that would be used to drive the economy. But the challenge now is, with so much debt that we have accumulated, and with so much need for capital investments in this country, the private sector will require a tremendous amount of capital. And therefore, capital markets will be generating so much resources for the private sector for growth and development. And at the same time, foreign capital would be coming into the country, which is going to encourage investors to come in, because investors, usually they don't come and with their dollars sticking out of their pockets. They come and ask which banks are going to provide us with loans that we're going to invest in the country. And also, one area that I look into is, especially for our young entrepreneurs, is the improvement in the telecom system in our country. Internet access has to be much more solid and strong for our entrepreneurs, especially those working on financial technology. I see Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya benefiting from this, where they have created billionaires out of youngsters who are startups or already doing very well. And therefore, it will be important to drive this economy through institutional setups in terms of improving the monetary policy and also the fiscal dimensions into bringing in foreign capital into this country.
What should be done to halt this inflation, not to hurdle the pace of the ongoing economy?
Right. So I think perspective is important when we talk about inflation in Ethiopia. If you go back the last 15 years, inflation has averaged 15%. So it's a structural challenge, and the reasons are multiple. But I think going forward, we need to address it in a way that will permanently reduce inflation to single digits, which is doable, but it requires a lot of work. So as I said, if you've concluded that it's a structural challenge, then the solutions also have to be structural. So, but what does that mean? One of the reasons, and what are the causes for inflation? For example, one is the imbalance between demand and supply. All right, there's the demand in Ethiopia today for goods and services far outstrips the country's ability to produce domestically and also to import from abroad. That's one reason. Secondly, imported inflation. I mean, I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, for example, that what we have been bringing from abroad, inflation-wise, price-wise, has increased very significantly. By the way, inflation has been a challenge even in the United States. Okay, it was hovering around 6-7%, and they're now starting. The Federal Reserve, for example, they increased interest rates to historical highs to reduce inflation. Okay, but when you import fuel, which has been going out in prices, 2 years ago, fuel prices in Addis were 35 birr per liter. Now it's 80 because fuel prices around the world had gone up to right now it's averaging 80. So the imported inflation had also had an impact. So these are big contributors. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine thing, for example, fertilizer prices have doubled or tripled in many cases. So these had an impact. So what are the solutions? One is to increase productivity domestically. And this also tied us to the earlier discussion where we had about manufacturing, the topic we had about domestic manufacturing. We need to produce stuff, a lot more stuff domestically. Discourage imports through taxes and other mechanisms, okay? So if we do, the other area that would impact us is, as the National Bank has started doing, there are new policies. If you look at the NB's strategy for the next 3 years, they have set a goal by June 2024, coming June, they're set a target of 20% of inflation. And then the following year, June 2025, 10%. And to do that, they have implemented, or at least rolling out, very innovative, very transparent monetary policies. For example, they've been mopping up excess liquidity from the market, from a marketplace. And secondly, they've restricted the amount of loan growth by banks. I think is 14% compared to prior years. So there's a number of actions by the government that's being taken to reduce inflation.
Well,
but at the end of the day, we now have targets, 20% this year, 10% next year. By then, we should be in the single digits and sustain it that way if we implement these policies effectively.
Well, you see, inflation is a very difficult task. And as Mr. Zmeden said, this is a global phenomenon. The United States has been struggling to bring down inflation from 9% to 3% for a long period of time. The Eurozone has the same kind of problems. And one of the challenges of inflation, of course, is that if we look at supply and demand, then, of course, the issue of supply becomes a question which the Prime Minister has raised in his speech to Parliament yesterday. And definitely we have to be able to provide supply, especially on the basket of goods that we use to measure inflation in terms of food commodities, clothing, transport, and others. The other issue is looking beyond the supply and demand. I see, especially in Addis Ababa, supply is plentiful. Electronic shops are full. We have more than 100 places where brand new cars costing over 40 million birrs that are being sold. Food shops are full. Clothing shops are full. So what this means is that the ability to pay for goods and services of most Ethiopians have not gone commensurate with the global developments under globalization in the quality of life that people have elsewhere. So for me, it's not just a question of the supply and demand, but it's also a question of the ability of people to pay, especially those with fixed salaries like government employees, pensioners, and people working under subhuman wage cannot afford the quality of life they've been utilizing before. And therefore, it's very important to look into one, monetary policy, which the National Bank has taken several steps, which Mr. Zemede said, and which I think is very much supported. The second thing is, in terms of the fiscal policy, our capital projects now have to be directed, as the Prime Minister has said very clearly, into food production, which constitutes the biggest basket of our inflationary costs. And therefore, it's very important to look into the human development side, where we have to look urgently into the production of goods and services that would reduce the amount of inflation in this country. Any inflation above 3% is not good news for the economy. And therefore, even bringing it down to 10% is not going to solve a lot of problems. And the kind of inflations that we have in different parts of the world, we've seen Sudan, we've seen West Africa, we've seen Central Africa, where inflation has brought big social turmoil, which governments cannot control. And therefore, it's very important that urgent tasks should be undertaken, not just something that's going to put in a 5-year plan, but something that we can do today to reduce inflation to a point where people can have either subsidies to wither away the inflationary pressures, or to bring in the commodities that are necessary within the basket of goods the central statistics office use to measure inflation. So I have high hopes that we can do this, but government institutions must work in synergy to be able to bring this down. It's not just the monetary policy that's important. It's the most important policy, but it's not just one. It's just one important policy. We have the fiscal policy, and we have different government agencies, regional institutions, worldwide institutions, in terms of the requisite human resources, where they all have to work in synergy to bring down the inflationary pressures in this country. We can produce the food, there is no question about it. We have a huge amount of water resources. Ethiopia is the water tower of Northeast Africa. We have huge amount of agricultural resources. We have a young generation. 70% of Ethiopians are able to work. And therefore, it is the ability of regional governments and worldwide governments to be able to bring this young generation to work on food production, to work on production inputs into our agro industries, into our industrial parks, so that we can have the supply ready. Otherwise, what is going to happen is we're going to continue importing food commodities like sugar, edible oil, children's foods. We're going to bring in apparel from abroad that we see in town, and I don't think inflation is going to get away. Moreover, I think part of the monetary policy is the kind of the devaluation of the birr that we've been seeing consistently, and bringing the black market value of the birr and the official exchange rate should also be a task that the government should be working on very, very vehemently. Otherwise, what's going to happen is, as long as we have the black market operations, we see a huge amount of illegal trade that's going on, illicit financial flows, which the Prime Minister has addressed in his interview yesterday. And with this kind of informal black economy that's being encouraged, it's going to be very, very difficult to control the inflationary pressures. The challenge is, we cannot solve the inflation independently of other economic factors, the exchange rate, the fiscal budgeting procedures, the tax collection systems. All these have to work in synergy to bring down inflation to the required level of probably 3 to 5%, which would be amenable for the economy.
Okay, talking about foreign direct investment, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed again said 1.5 million jobs were created for citizens within the past 5 months. I mean, what is your comment on this?
So in terms of FDI, again, we need to put things in context. The latest data we have, the annual data we have from UNCTAD for last year, Ethiopia was amongst the top 5 largest recipients of FDI in Africa. Okay, again, it's impressive because of the internal issues and the external global issues that Ethiopia is facing, but it was like 3 or 4 times more than what, for example, our neighbor Kenya received. That's one way to look at it. But on the other hand, the size of the economy, as you and I have discussed this in the past, that is, Ethiopia has the 3rd largest GDP in sub-Saharan Africa, got $156 billion, close to 160 billion.
Yes.
And with the 2nd largest population on the continent, we can do better. We need to do better in terms of attracting FDI. Meaning, if we're at 3.5 billion annually, I think we need to be at 7 to 10 over the next 5 to 7 years. And we should, and we can. Again, there are a lot of competitive advantages Ethiopia has that virtually no other African country, maybe 1 or 2, have. So when we talk about FDI, creating jobs, that's one side of it. By the way, FDI is not just for creating jobs. We will have knowledge, know-how, technology transfer when big companies, big multinationals, and other investors come to Ethiopia. So we need to encourage it. A lot of people ask me a lot of them, why are we supporting, why are we encouraging FDI? Well, there's no country in the world whose economy has been transformed without FDI. If you look at China, one of the reasons the Chinese got to this level, not the only one, but one of the major reasons, because they were able to attract 100+ billion FDI annually for years and years and years. Now, of course, China is now a major global FDI investor, outbound FDI. If you look at Singapore, if you look at South Korea, all these countries. So FDI, as part of the economic transformation, needs to be encouraged. And Ethiopia is doing that. But what I'm saying is, over the next few years, we should target very large numbers. We're happy we're in the top 3, 4 today. But what we should be comparing ourselves is, we want to be like the Asian tigers. We want to be like South Korea in terms of a very upward developed economy in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I'll give you an example. And this is doable. I mean, our friends from Wall Street, the world's largest investment bank, Goldman Sachs, has a forecast that in the next 4 decades, Ethiopia will be the 16th largest economy in the world at $6.2 trillion. That's 6.2 trillion American dollars. Imagine that. Okay, exactly outranking a lot of the G7 countries' economies today. And one of the ways we'll get there is by attracting large volumes of FDI, where Ethiopia has competitive and comparative advantages. We have a very large labor pool, competitive cost, very talented. You can educate them and transform it. South Korea today does not produce a single barrel of oil, but it's the 11th largest economy in the world by investing in its people. So when we talk about FDI, let it come in, but also get our domestic private sector to also be the engine block, which partners with foreign investors to make Ethiopia essentially the Asian tiger version of Africa. And that is doable. FDI is very important, but I think we can do even more in the coming years. We're looking at between 7 to 10 billion annually. I would say achievable, but between the next 5 to 6, 7 years. I think it's doable, but you just need a lot of focus to make it happen.
Dr. Konstantinos Brutasfa, Senior Policy Advisor to the UN, and also Mr. Zamadena Negatu, a very senior economist in Africa and beyond, as well as chairperson for Fairfax Africa Fund. Thank you for your time, both of you.
Thank you
for having me.
This brings us to the end of our edition for today. See you next time with another edition. Bye bye. Take care. Have a good one.